given India's rivalry with Pakistan, it wouldn't be surprising for India to try to leverage the BLA to cause instability with Pakistan.
Jacob Zenn is the editor of Terrorism Monitor and Militant Leadership Monitor at the Jamestown Foundation, and he's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He's joining us today from Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. We'll be talking to him about the Baloch Liberation Army, the way it operates, and who backs it. Thank you so much, Mr. Zenn, for joining us. If we can start by asking you about the basic profile of Baloch Liberation Army. How does it operate, its MOU, its operations, and how does it compare to other terrorist organizations in the world?
Sure. So the BLA is part of a conglomeration of separatist militant groups in the Balochistan region of Pakistan. And over the past several years, you've seen various actors within this coalition come together and merge and conduct some increasingly brazen attacks. In a certain sense, they tend to be a relatively standard type of insurgent group that you'd see around the world, in the sense that they often operate in remote regions, carry out ambushes and surprise attacks. They may attack roadways. They may attack security personnel of the Pakistani state. They may also, as we've seen over the past years, attack, in particular, Chinese personnel who are involved in the Belt and Road Initiative or Gwadar port activities because they view themselves as not acquiring sufficient resources from the economic activities that occur in the region. And that's not an uncommon grievance that you see from groups elsewhere in the world. A lot of their attacks these days are also video recorded, and then they're published on the internet in one way or another, along with music to hype up their cause. Their cause also seems to have a little bit of an overlap between separatist activism and the militancy, which again is not all that uncommon around the world. Pakistan has also alleged countless times that India or other actors are involved in backing these separatist militant groups. I would say that's not implausible, although what ties exist are kept clandestine and not easy to see. It would not be surprising because it's well known that India claims that Pakistan supports anti-Indian groups, particularly in Kashmir, so it wouldn't be that uncommon for India to do the same in Pakistan as a means of unsettling the country and causing instability. It's also important to note that these Baloch separatist militant groups are generally secular, as opposed to the Islamist kind that you might see from the TTP or other groups that have been involved in the AFPAC border region. Some of their attacks have also shown increasing levels of coordination, involving dozens, if not hundreds, of militants involved in attacks.
You spoke about their operations. There's one distinction that I need to make. Pakistan calls this as a terrorist group because it has been banned not just by Pakistan, but by the United States, by the United Kingdom, the EU, China, and Iran. But I want to talk to you about their operations. You mentioned some of their terrorist attacks. They hijacked a train in Balochistan, and they've also targeted Chinese workers, as you said. Why should someone sitting in Washington or in London actually care about BLA? Should they be worried?
Well, here's where there's increasing complications, I would say, at least in Washington. As you mentioned, civilians have increasingly been caught up in these attacks by the Baloch militants. The train attack, as you mentioned, the Chinese engineers and other personnel, for example. And that is why is among the reasons why the groups are classified as terrorist groups. The U.S. was engaged in the war on terror for at least 20 some odd years after 9/11. And under that framework, there was a general understanding that Washington and its partners would combat terrorist groups around the world. However, I would argue that the world and Washington are moving somewhat beyond the global war on terrorism framework. And that although the Baloch militant groups that we've mentioned are classified as terrorist groups, you might not see the same level of attention as you would have, say, before 2022, when countering terrorism was the paramount U.S. Priority. That doesn't mean the U.S. Will ignore it, but it seems like we're moving beyond a war on terror framework. And just because a group is a terrorist group, nowadays it might not get the same attention from Washington or other capitals around the world. That being said, although relations between Islamabad and Washington have often been tense, and there's been ups and downs over the years, there has been a partnership and a general level of understanding between the two capitals and the governments. And Pakistan is definitely a country that the United States does not want to see destabilized, either by war with India, either by conflict with the Taliban, or by domestic insurgent groups such as the militants or the TTP or other terrorist groups. And therefore, the U.S. has an interest in keeping these types of attacks at bay and keeping Pakistan as a stable country, as a country that's economically developing, and of course, as a nuclear country. So it does warrant attention from Washington, but whether it's getting the attention that it deserves is another question.
The reason I mentioned the designation from different European capitals, even China as well, because I really wanted to get a sense on how the world views BLA right now, and how does this threat it transcends from Pakistan to the world. Because if it is getting noticed by Washington, as you said, or by Beijing, or even the EU, that essentially means that there is some level of cognizance in those capitals, that BLA is a threat to them as well. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that countries that label a group such as the BLA as a terrorist group recognize that terrorism anywhere is a challenge to world or global stability anywhere in principle, and therefore it's in the interest of the U.S. and other groups to see these militant groups stopped, to move towards a form of negotiation over grievances, and to see calm return to that region. So that would be absolutely correct.
Yeah. So one interesting thing that I noticed about Jamestown Foundation work, some of your colleagues, they've mentioned something paradoxical. They're saying that, this designation by the Western capitals, it was essentially a little bit counterproductive because it raised BLA's profile. What would you say to that?
That's an interesting point. And I actually do have to say that if you do a comparative analysis, it may have some legitimacy. I'll just use another example from around the world, Boko Haram in Nigeria, a group that I've studied much. When US presidents have made statements like we need to clamp down on Boko Haram, or we need to designate Boko Haram as a terrorist group, or we need to support Nigeria to counter Boko Haram has then used that in its propaganda to say, oh, look, we're really important. We're a big group. We're getting classified as terrorist groups. We're not nobodies anymore. So it is possible that the fact that the BLA has caught the attention of Beijing, London, Washington, even if they name it as a terrorist group, which is a negative label and a label that indicates opposition to the group, it could be shown by the group internally that, look how powerful we are, that other capitals are viewing us as a terrorist group, that we're important enough to be designated. So it could have this sort of counter effect. At the same time, it's often necessary to label a group as a terrorist group in order to elevate certain legal structures to counter the group, such as terrorism financing. But I would have to say it is somewhat of a double-edged sword, in that labeling a group as a terrorist group can, in some ways, sometimes elevate its profile.
Okay, so about the Indian support that you mentioned, there's a long history of Pakistan submitting dossiers at international forums, giving evidences, arresting Indian spies from Balochistan area, and this has been well documented that there is some level of Indian interference in Balochistan. What would you say to that? And considering the fact that the operations of BLA, their magnitude, the level of preparedness, it does signal that there is some level of external support to BLA. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think you would be correct to say that the growing level of sophistication of attacks in any terrorist group, including the BLA, often indicates that there is some type of outside funding or training or weapons smuggling networks. And you actually see this throughout South Asia. And some of the groups in Myanmar, for example, that have seen an upsurge in their capabilities, there's often indications that they're likely getting some funding from elsewhere. And so something has to account for the BLA's increasing sophistication. And external funding, training, weapons would seem to make sense. And given India's rivalry with Pakistan, it wouldn't be surprising for India to try to leverage the BLA to cause instability with Pakistan.
If you were to advise the US government or the United Nations or Western capitals in terms of vis-a-vis BLA, what would you say to them?
In terms of the United Nations and these other international platforms, they often don't carry teeth. In other words, they have trouble enforcing their programs and policies. There are institutions like the UN, as I mentioned, that can be involved in countering terrorism financing. They can be involved in weapons smuggling and other forms of illicit funding for the organization. And perhaps involved in international criminal justice against terrorists who have killed innocent people, for example. So those are some ways that the international bodies could be leveraged in this conflict. Although it's most likely that the Pakistani state will, of course, bear the burden of clamping down on the militant activities.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zenn.